Look, it's going to bomb. Got it? The blast wave will reach us. All of Russia is exploding. Today is August 2nd, Saturday. My name is Igor Havrishchak. Be sure to subscribe to YouTube on the 24th. There is a link to my YouTube channel. Also, please subscribe, like, and comment on your impressions of these strikes, and I will tell you in detail where the defense forces struck the territory of the Russian Federation. We also recall the meeting between Lukashenko and Putin, ultimatums. Putin reiterated his demands for an end to the war in Ukraine. And Trump is threatening Russia with nuclear weapons after such reckless statements from Dmitry Medvedev. Let's start with where the Ukrainian defense forces were bombing on the night of August 1st and 2. The Novokuybishevsk refinery was hit, as you have just seen, as well as the Electropribor plant in Penza, and the Ryazan refinery was hit. These are great hits. In addition, the carpet plan was announced, introduced at the airports of Saratov, Tambov, Penza, and Samara. In the Rostov region, there was a hit to a traction station, a substation, called Likhaya Zamchalova. You see, these are hits to logistics. Earlier, we talked about how logistics is suffering in July, especially for the Russians, and they cannot bring everything they need to the front. And of course, the meeting between Lukashenko and Putin, which took place yesterday on the island of Valam. This is Lake Ladoga, near the border with NATO, near Finland. So Putin was talking about the conditions for ending the war. This was the first time he responded to Trump's ultimatum, mentioning the government in Ukraine is not legitimate. And through his lips, Lukashenko said he was ready for an airborne truce. Putin said all this at a joint press conference with Lukashenko for the propaganda media. Let's analyze the dictator's statements. According to Putin, the main task in resolving the so-called conflict in Ukraine is to eradicate the causes of this conflict, and he emphasized that he had voiced his ultimatums back in the summer, in June of last year. What did he say then? Ukrainian troops should completely withdraw from 4 regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. He is talking on administrative borders of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. Also, a commitment from Ukraine that it will not join NATO, Ukraine's neutral, non-aligned, non-nuclear status. These are Putin's demands, which are absolutely unacceptable. The dictator also cynically declared peace as he sees it. To quote, "We need a long and lasting peace on good basic foundations that would satisfy both the Russian Federation and Ukraine and ensure the security of both countries." And perhaps those negotiators from the Ukrainian side are right, who, by the way, carefully but still put forward the idea that we should talk about European security in general. Absolutely wild statements. Remember, back in 2022 in Istanbul, Russia even dared to offer security guarantees for Ukraine. The country that kills Ukrainians says, "We will give you security guarantees." They are crazy. About the Istanbul talks, Putin said, "I assess them as generally positive." How can we not be positive about the fact that hundreds of people have returned to their homeland? It is manipulation. The fact that hundreds of Ukrainian heroes are returning home is very important. But this is Putin's substitution of concepts, because the point of the meeting in Istanbul is not to talk about exchange. There is talk of an exchange. Again, it is very important that our heroes are returning. The most important news, but the essence of the meeting in Istanbul, is the ceasefire. And here there are no steps from the Kremlin. The Russian leader also commented on the recent statements of Zelensky, who said that there is no point in negotiating with Russia now, and that we should wait for the regime change. What did the dictator say? We can wait. If Ukraine's leadership believes that now is not the time, let's wait. We are ready, Putin said. He added that the Russian political regime is based on the Constitution of Russia, and the government is formed in accordance with the basic law. The same cannot be said about Ukraine. Of course, he points out that not everything is in accordance with the constitution, and that elections were supposed to be held in Ukraine. We have mentioned these manipulations. For the first time, Putin also mentioned Trump's ultimatum, these 10 days that end on August 8th. How did he respond to these words? He did not answer Trump directly, but in a veiled way. As for any disappointments on the part of anyone, all disappointments arise from excessive expectations. This is a well-known general rule. But in order to approach the issue peacefully, we need to have in-depth conversations and not in public, and this should be done calmly in the quiet of the negotiation process. So what Putin said to Trump, "I don't care about your worries and disappointments. I will continue to fight." He mentioned that they would have Oreshnik on an industrial scale on an assembly line and would quickly hand it over to Lukashenko. What did Lukashenko himself say? Through the lips of the dictator of Belarus, he actually relayed Putin's thoughts. First, he said that we need to look for a truce, that Zelensky and Ukraine should run after Putin, and that there is a truce in the sky. So what did he say? Self-proclaimed president of Belarus Lukashenko said that Russia is allegedly interested in negotiations with Ukraine. But the Ukrainian side allegedly does not want this. According to him, Ukraine should already be asking Moscow to negotiate a peace agreement. To quote, "If you don't like it in Belarus, fine, then at least go to the moon anywhere." Today, Ukraine should be begging, "Let's sit down at the negotiating table." Otherwise, in a month and a half or two, there won't even be any defensive structures left. The Russians will slowly chew it all up, seize it, and move on. And by the way, when Lukashenko said this, Putin interrupted him and said, "No, we are returning our lands, we are not seizing." Lukashenko smiled at this. He also added that it was necessary to prepare the appropriate ground for a meeting between the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. He accused the Ukrainian leader of having no desire and no steps for such a meeting and of doing nothing. And I'll just remind you of the words of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States of America, who said the following just the day before: "We continue to engage with the Russian side, but we have not seen any progress," said Marco Rubio. According to the Secretary of State, President Trump has been working for more than 6 months to engage with the Russian side for peace in Ukraine. But the situation is not changing. This is what is really happening. By the way, according to Lukashenko, he asked the American delegation to convey the following words to President Donald Trump. "Russia is interested in this and Putin, but you don't want this. Tell Zelensky to go for it, so that there are no flying machines and they don't fall on people's heads." It exploded and hit a 10-story building where ordinary people lived. So this is a dangerous escalation. I don't know, maybe Lukashenko has gone completely crazy over there and he's just quoting what Putin is doing in Ukraine, because it was he who quoted and described Russia's genocidal attacks on Ukraine. Remember the terrible attack on Kyiv on July 30 to 31. Instead, Ukraine uses drones exclusively on critical infrastructure and military infrastructure. That's what we're talking about. Hitting refineries, hitting traction substations to prevent weapons from going to the front in Ukraine. These are the key strikes of the Ukrainian defense forces. And he says, by the way, that Putin is ready for an air ceasefire. But I will remind you that in Jeddah in March, the delegation of Ukraine and the United States agreed on an unconditional ceasefire, including in the sky and on the rear. To which Putin said, "Okay, but I have a few conditions." And the conditions were unrealistic, and accordingly, of course, Russia did not agree to a ceasefire. And it continues to hit Ukraine. Therefore, this is an absolute manipulation and a lie. On Donald Trump, the US president still retains leverage to achieve a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine. This was stated by US Permanent Representative to NATO Matthew Whitaker. According to him, tough US sanctions against Russia and countries that do business with it will come into effect next week if the Kremlin dictator does not agree to a ceasefire. To quote Whitaker, and I believe Trump's statements that on August 8th, in the absence of a ceasefire, he will impose, I would say, crippling tariffs and sanctions on Russia. Putin needs to sell his oil, Whitaker emphasized. The US ambassador to NATO added that Putin sells oil to India, Brazil, and China. These countries will also face serious consequences for their cooperation with Russia. Russia will have no friends, no trading partners, and its ability to finance the war will be over, Whitaker said. Ultimately, he said, a ceasefire must be achieved, and this can only be achieved through diplomacy and negotiations. Whitaker does not see ideal conditions for both sides in the agreement, but this should not stop Ukraine and Russia from stopping the bloodshed. Indeed, there are problems with oil sales in Russia right now. India is beginning to refuse Russia's black bloody gold. Brazil was sanctioned, as you know, by Trump, 40%. China is a separate case. I think that the US will wait with China. They will not impose any sanctions, because they themselves are dependent on the resources they need, which they buy from China. By the way, there is also Turkey. So indeed, if Trump does impose these sanctions, Russia will have huge problems. Bloomberg says that amid Trump's threats, India has increased its oil purchases from the US and the UAE. The agency cited traders as saying that Indian state-owned oil companies have purchased at least 5 million barrels of oil from the US and 2 million barrels from the UAE. The contracts provide for relatively quick delivery. Earlier this week, a state-owned oil company purchased 4 million barrels of West African oil. We see the increase in purchasing activity from India as a sign of supply diversification aimed at reducing dependence on Russian supplies, said the head of global crude oil supply at the company. After the start of Russia's full-scale war, India became the world's largest buyer of Russian oil exported by sea. As I told you earlier, they buy more than half of this oil, which Russia sends by tanker through the water. But after the US president threatened to impose duties on India for buying Russian oil, Indian state-owned oil companies are starting to stop buying Russian oil. Moreover, I want to tell you that these duties have not yet been introduced. Trump imposed a 25% duty on India, which is a different trade agreement. And from August 8, if India continues to buy, he will impose 100% of the duties. That's why India is starting to pull away, because the Indian economy is not strong enough to agree to these sanctions and try to work under them. Trump also responded to Medvedev. The US president has announced his own order to deploy 2 nuclear submarines in the relevant areas, in case the stupid and provocative statements of former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev turn out to be something more. To quote, he is the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council. Words are very important and can lead to unpredictable consequences. Thank you for your attention to this issue. Let me remind you of what Medvedev said. Just yesterday, in response to Trump's ultimatum and the fact that the economies of India and Russia are effectively dead, Medvedev mentioned a dead hand. I'll remind you what Medvedev wrote. Quote, and about the dead economies of India and Russia and entering dangerous territory, let him remember his favorite movies about the walking dead and how dangerous a dead hand can be, which does not seem to exist in nature. What did Medvedev mean by these words? A dead hand, as the perimeter system is called in the West. A system for automatically launching nuclear missiles at targets in the US and NATO countries, created during the Soviet era. It was supposed to be triggered in the event of the death of the High Command or another emergency in the USSR, and now in Russia. So Medvedev threatened the US with a nuclear strike. And accordingly, Trump said that now we are redeploying 2 of our nuclear submarines so that Russia will not feel so comfortable. The head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, reacted to this. He first wrote, Medvedev didn't seem to believe that vodka would do any good. Later, he also posted a video of Dmitry Medvedev's legendary dancing to American Boy music, but for some unknown reason, Yermak later deleted it. Trump also spoke differently about the losses in the war. Look, what did he write? I have just been informed that almost 20,000 Russian soldiers have been killed this month in the senseless war with Ukraine. Since the beginning of the year, Russia has lost 112,500 soldiers. This is a lot of unnecessary victims. However, Ukraine also suffered great losses. Since January 1st, 2025, it has lost approximately 8,000 soldiers. And this figure does not include the missing. Ukraine also lost civilians, but in smaller numbers when Russian missiles hit Ukrainian cities. This is a war that should never have happened. This is Biden's war, not Trump's. I'm only here to try to stop it, Trump's traditional words. Because he always used to say, this week 5,000 Ukrainian and Russian soldiers died, and here the losses have increased. But the most interesting thing is that perhaps for the first time in his rhetoric, Trump has shared Russian and Ukrainian losses. During the week, there were 7,000 casualties in the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. He emphasized that the Russian occupiers have such losses and Ukraine has such losses. He also mentioned the civilian population of Ukraine, which suffers from Russian bombing. Trump distinguishes between aggressor and victim. Trump distinguishes between killers and defenders. Moreover, the US and NATO allies are developing a scheme under which European countries will be able to transfer money to a special American fund to pay for the purchase and transfer of American weapons to Ukraine. According to Reuters, the mechanism is called PURIL. It is noted that the process begins with Kyiv compiling lists of the highest priority weapons in packages of about $500 million. If one of the European countries is ready to transfer something from this list to Ukraine, it will be able to buy a similar replacement in the United States, bypassing lengthy procedures for approving military supplies, but will have to pay for the replacement in advance. At the same time, European countries will also be able to simply order the relevant goods from the US. This will speed up the supply and replenishment of allies' stocks, bypassing lengthy procedures. One of the packages is already being discussed. The newspaper also writes that the allies hope to use this method to supply Ukraine with the first major package of arms worth $10 billion. They call this goal ambitious, but no one has specified a time frame for achieving it. It is important to note that this package should obviously include, first of all, air defense equipment. It is important that the initiative is being implemented in parallel with the program of emergency supplies from US. You know, this is the PDA program. Biden still has about $4 billion left under this program, and Trump, sources said, seems ready to transfer some of the funds. We will keep an eye on it, and of course, we will be waiting for August 8th. That was the most important news as of the morning of August 2. The Defense Forces did a great job on very important oil refineries. It's been a long time since we've had these hits. Please subscribe to YouTube 24. There is a link to my YouTube channel in the description. Like, comment, write where you are looking from. Your comments, they are welcome.